In 1948, there were more than 850,000 Jews living across the Arab world. Today, fewer than 8,600 remain. That is a decline of over 99% in a single lifetime. And yet, when the world discusses refugees from the Middle East, this particular exodus, the largest forced displacement of Jews since the Holocaust, is almost never mentioned. This is the story of how communities that had existed for more than 2,500 years were erased from the map in less than 25 years. It is a story documented in government decrees, immigration records, testimony archives, and the personal accounts of hundreds of thousands of survivors. And it is a story that most of the world has never been told. To understand what happened, you have to understand what existed before. Jewish communities across the Middle East and North Africa were not recent arrivals. They were not European transplants. They were indigenous populations whose roots in the region predated the rise of Islam by more than 1,000 years. The Jewish community in Iraq traced its origins to the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE, the very exile described in the Book of Psalms, where the captives wept by the rivers of Babylon. By the 20th century, that community had been present continuously for 2,600 years. In Baghdad alone, Jews constituted 1/6 of the city's population. They were bankers, merchants, physicians, members of parliament. They ran schools, hospitals, philanthropic institutions. Iraq had 28 Jewish educational institutions in Baghdad, 16 under the supervision of community committees, and the rest privately operated. The number of students reached 12,000. Roughly 400 Jewish students were pursuing degrees in medicine, law, economics, pharmacy, and engineering. This was not a marginal community clinging to the edges of society. This was a community woven into the very fabric of Iraqi urban life. And Iraq was not unique. In Egypt, the Jewish population had grown from 25,000 in 1900 to over 80,000 by 1948, with prominent roles in finance, industry, and cultural life. In Morocco, 265,000 Jews lived in communities spanning centuries. In Yemen, 55,000 Jews maintained traditions dating back to the era of King Solomon. Tunisia held 150,000. Algeria, 140,000. Libya, 38,000. Syria, 40,000. Lebanon, 10,000. Across the entire Arab world, these communities collectively represented a civilization, a web of synagogues, schools, courts, cemeteries, businesses, languages, and traditions that had evolved over millennia. Then, in the span of a single generation, nearly all of it was destroyed. The unraveling did not begin in 1948. It began earlier, with the contamination of Arab political culture by European fascism. In Iraq, the German embassy in Baghdad, headed by a diplomat named Fritz Grobber, spent the 1930s cultivating anti-Jewish sentiment. The embassy purchased an Arabic-language newspaper called Al-Alam al-Arabi and used it to publish anti-Semitic propaganda, including a serialized Arabic translation of Mein Kampf. Germany financed a youth organization called Al-Fatwa, modeled directly on the Hitler Youth. Iraqi intellectuals and military officers were invited to Berlin as guests of the Nazi Party. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, exiled from Palestine, arrived in Baghdad and used Radio Berlin's Arabic language service, launched in 1939, to pour fuel on an already smoldering fire. The explosion came on the 1st and 2nd of June 1941 during the Jewish holiday of Shavuot. What followed is known as the Farhud, an Arabic word meaning violent dispossession. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, rioters murdered between 150 and 180 Jews in Baghdad over the course of 48 hours. 600 more were injured. An undetermined number of women were raped. Approximately 1,500 stores and homes were looted or destroyed. The rioters included soldiers, police officers, school children, members of paramilitary youth movements, and civilians from the city's outskirts. According to the official report of the Iraqi Government Commission of Inquiry, established on the 7th of June, 128 Jews were killed, 210 were injured, and over 1,500 businesses and homes were damaged. The community leadership estimated that about 2,500 families, 15% of the Jewish community in Baghdad, suffered directly. The Farhud was a watershed. According to historian Daphne Tsimhony, whose research was published by Palgrave Macmillan, it was the first and only pogrom against Jews in modern Iraq, and it marked the culmination of a transformation in Jewish-Muslim relations in a country where Jews had been, until that point, a well-integrated and successful minority. And yet, even after the Farhud, many Iraqi Jews stayed. Some who had fled returned. They believed it was an aberration. The Iraqi government cracked down on the pro-Nazi elements, tried rioters in military courts, and executed several army officers involved in the incitement. For a few years, it seemed like the wound might heal. It did not heal. In 1948, the creation of the State of Israel transformed the political landscape entirely. Iraq made Zionism a capital offense. Jews were dismissed from government positions. A prominent Jewish businessman named Shafiq Adez was publicly hanged in Basra in September 1948 on charges of treason, a spectacle designed to terrorize the entire community. Then, in March 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law that seemed paradoxical. It allowed Jews to emigrate, but only if they permanently renounced their Iraqi citizenship. At first, the community hesitated. Some Zionist organizations urged caution until property rights could be clarified. But then, on the 10th of March 1951, with 64,000 Jews still waiting to leave, the government enacted a second law, this one freezing the assets of every Jew who had given up citizenship. Overnight, tens of thousands of people became both stateless and penniless. What followed was one of the largest airlifts in the history of population transfers. Operation Ezra and Nehemiah, named after the biblical figures who led Jews from Babylonian exile back to Judea in the 5th century BCE, transported between 120,000 and 130,000 Iraqi Jews to Israel between 1950 and 1952. The operation was conducted by the Near East Transport Company and El Al, funded primarily by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee at a cost of $4 million. In its first month alone, 50,000 Iraqi Jews signed up to leave. The planes flew first to Cyprus, then later directly from Baghdad to Lod Airport. By the time the operation ended in early 1952, only about 6,000 Jews remained in Iraq. The 28 Jewish schools were closed. The Jewish School for the Blind, the only institution of its kind in Baghdad, was shut down. Out of 60 synagogues operating in 1950, only 7 remained after 1970. Most public buildings belonging to the community were seized by the government for minimal or no compensation. The community that had existed since the time of Nebuchadnezzar was, for all practical purposes, gone. But Iraq was only one chapter. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. In Yemen, the Jewish community, estimated at 55,000, had lived under dhimmi status for centuries, enduring particular cruelties including the Orphans' Decree, which mandated that if a Jewish child's father died, the child would be taken by the state and forcibly converted to Islam. When the United Nations Partition Plan was announced in November 1947, anti-Jewish riots erupted in the British colony of Aden, killing 82 Jews and destroying homes and businesses across the Jewish quarter. The violence was the trigger for an exodus that had been building for decades. In May 1949, Yemen's Imam Ahmad unexpectedly allowed his Jewish subjects to leave. What followed was Operation Magic Carpet, officially named Operation On Wings of Eagles, from the verse in Exodus. I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Between June 1949 and September 1950, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee organized approximately 380 flights, primarily using Alaska Airlines aircraft, to airlift roughly 49,000 Yemeni Jews from Aden to Israel. Most of these people had never seen an airplane. They had walked hundreds of kilometers through desert and mountain terrain, carrying Torah scrolls and little else, to reach the transit camp in Aden. The planes, DC-4 aircraft licensed to carry 60 passengers, routinely flew with 150 Yemeni Jews per flight, a feat made possible only by the small stature and low body weight of a population that had lived in near-starvation conditions. Pilot Stanley Epstein, who participated in the operation, later said that it had to have been blessed by God because the possibility of any of these airplanes being successful was pretty remote. According to the research of Esther Mir-Glitzenstein of Ben-Gurion University, the operation's humanitarian image conceals a harsher reality. Roughly 700 Yemeni Jews died at the transit camp in Aden, buried in an adjacent cemetery. An additional 150 died during the journey between the North Yemen border and the British Protectorate. Conditions in the camp were catastrophic. Contaminated water, inadequate shelter, minimal medical facilities, overcrowding that accelerated outbreaks of malaria, dysentery, and trachoma. 3 separate Knesset committees later investigated the operation and found that some staffers had engaged in black market smuggling while immigrants suffered. And yet, not a single aircraft was lost across all 380 sorties. Every plane that took off landed. The Yemeni Jewish community, one of the oldest in the world, was emptied almost entirely. As of 2021, fewer than a handful of Jews remain in Yemen, facing threats from Houthi forces demanding conversion or death. In Libya, the trajectory was equally devastating. Approximately 38,000 Jews lived there in 1948. The violence against them began even before the creation of Israel. In November 1945, anti-Jewish riots in Tripoli killed more than 140 Jews. In 1942, the Jewish quarter of Benghazi had been occupied by Nazi forces, and more than 2,000 Libyan Jews were deported to forced labor camps. By the end of the war, 1/5 of them had perished. The violence resumed in June 1948, when 15 more Jews were killed and 280 homes were destroyed. By the early 1950s, nearly 31,000 Libyan Jews had emigrated to Israel. A law enacted in 1961 required special permits to prove Libyan citizenship, a transparent mechanism for stripping Jews of legal status. After the Six-Day War in 1967, the remaining community was effectively annihilated. Today, there are 0 Jews in Libya. And then there was Egypt, where the expulsion was carried out with bureaucratic precision that deserves particular attention. In 1948, Egypt's Jewish population numbered between 75,000 and 80,000. Jews had played a central role in Egyptian finance, industry, and culture for centuries. The oldest continuously operating synagogue in the world is in Cairo. But on the 26th of January 1952, a day known as Black Saturday, anti-British demonstrations in Cairo spiraled into riots that targeted Jewish businesses, destroying 500 establishments and leaving many Jews injured or dead. Things grew dramatically worse after the Suez crisis of 1956, when Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt in response to Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. The Egyptian government turned on its Jewish population with systematic ferocity. On the 23rd of November 1956, a proclamation signed by the Minister of Religious Affairs was read aloud in mosques across the country. According to the Fathom Journal, which documented this period extensively, The proclamation declared that all Jews were Zionists and enemies of the state and promised their imminent expulsion. What followed was methodical. Between November 1956 and March 1957, the assets of at least 500 Jewish-owned businesses were sequestered and their bank accounts frozen. 800 more enterprises were blacklisted, 95% of which were under Jewish ownership. The Egyptian custodian deducted 10% of their value for so-called administrative purposes. The testimonies from this period are specific and verifiable. A woman named Lillian Abda was swimming in the Suez Canal when Egyptian soldiers arrested her. She was charged with attempting to relay information to Israeli forces. She later recalled, "She was brought to the police station in her bathing suit. The next day, her entire family was expelled from the country." Sarah Fedida's husband Joe, a British subject, arrived at his office one morning to find red seals on the door. He was never allowed to enter again. He could not retrieve his personal belongings or papers from the safe. Everything had been confiscated. Jenny Stewart recalled that each person was allowed to take only £20. She sewed a £10 note into the hem of her dress. Her mother's jewelry was confiscated by immigration officers at the airport. The first wave of expellees were forced to sign declarations stating that they were donating their property to the Egyptian government. They were permitted to take one suitcase and a small sum of cash. Customs officials routinely ransacked luggage, stealing whatever valuables they could find. Sarah Fedida described being taken aside for a search. Her infant's carry cot was turned upside down, while her mother pleaded to accompany her and was refused. Between 23,000 and 25,000 Jews left Egypt between November 1956 and the end of 1957. The Six-Day War of 1967 triggered a second wave. Almost all Jewish men without foreign passports were detained. The community dwindled to a few thousand, then a few hundred, then a few dozen. Today, according to multiple sources, approximately 30 Jews remain in Egypt, most of them elderly. The Egyptian case is especially instructive because it illustrates how the expulsions worked across the region. The pattern repeated with variations in each country, but the core mechanism was the same. First, legislation stripped Jews of citizenship or made their civic participation impossible. Then, economic strangulation confiscated businesses, froze accounts, and prohibited employment in key professions. Then, physical violence, pogroms, arrests, detentions created an atmosphere of terror. And finally, the trap closed. Jews could leave, but only if they abandoned everything. This was not random. According to the World Jewish Congress, the Political Committee of the Arab League drafted model legislation in 1947, before the creation of Israel, before the 1948 war, that recommended a coordinated strategy of repressive measures against Jewish residents across all member states. The timing is critical. As the Middle East Forum's analysis of the period notes, citing the work of historian Yaakov Meron, the Egyptian delegate, Haikal Pasha, publicly announced a program to expel Jews from Arab countries 5 months before the mass departure of Palestinians from what would become Israel even began. The journalist and historian Walid Khalidi, described as perhaps the leading Palestinian nationalist historian, confirmed that not a single Arab village had been vacated by its inhabitants before March 1948. The Arab League's plans for its Jewish populations were already in motion. This does not diminish the complexity of the story. Scholars like Philip Mendes, writing in the Australian Journal of Jewish Studies, have rightly argued that the exodus cannot be attributed solely to push factors. There were pull factors too. The emotional and religious power of Zionism, the economic opportunities of a new state, active Israeli efforts to encourage immigration, including the Jewish Agency's 1 million plan. The historian Yehoshua Porath has argued that comparing the Jewish exodus to the Palestinian displacement oversimplifies both. And some Israeli historians, including those of the so-called New Historian School, have debated the degree to which Israel itself shaped the conditions that accelerated the departure. But the documented evidence of coordinated persecution, legal dispossession, and violent expulsion is overwhelming. Between 1948 and the early 1970s, the Jewish population across all Arab countries dropped from between 758,000 and 881,000 to near zero. Communities that predated Islam by a millennium were dismantled. Synagogues that had stood for centuries were shuttered or destroyed. Cemeteries that held 2,500 years of burials were desecrated or bulldozed. Schools that had educated generations were closed. Languages, Judeo-Arabic dialects that were unique to each community, began to die. And the world, for the most part, said nothing. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees recognized displaced Jews from Arab countries as bona fide refugees. But the UN offered no practical assistance. The General Assembly has not passed a single resolution addressing the plight of Jewish refugees from Arab countries. Not one, across more than 7 decades. When UN Security Council Resolution 242, the Madrid Peace Conference, the Roadmap, and the bilateral agreements between Israel and the neighboring states all referred to a just solution of the refugee problem, they never distinguished between Arab and Jewish refugees. In practice, the phrase came to mean only one group. The property left behind by these Jewish communities has never been returned. According to Justice for Jews from Arab countries, the confiscated assets, urban and rural land, buildings, businesses, household possessions, communal properties including synagogues, schools, hospitals and cemeteries, amount to a value that, by some estimates, corresponds to an area of land 5 times the size of Israel itself. No International Claims Commission has ever been established to address this dispossession. Article 8 of the 1979 Israel-Egypt Peace Treaty included a provision for a claims commission to address confiscated Jewish property. That commission was never created. In 2014, Israel designated the 30th of November as an annual day of commemoration, Yom HaPlitim, the Day of Commemoration for Jewish refugees from Arab countries and Iran. The date was chosen to coincide with the day after the United Nations voted for the partition plan in 1947, which triggered the first wave of anti-Jewish violence across the region. It is a date that most of the world does not observe, and most people outside the Jewish community have never heard of. The descendants of these refugees now constitute the majority of Israel's Jewish population. They came from Baghdad and Cairo, from Sana'a and Tripoli, from Casablanca and Tunis, from Aleppo and Beirut. They arrived with 1 suitcase or less. They were placed in transit camps, ma'abarot, where conditions were often harsh, where Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews sometimes faced discrimination from the European Ashkenazi establishment. They rebuilt their lives from nothing in a country that was itself barely surviving. And their story, the story of how an entire civilization was uprooted, dispossessed, and scattered, has been, until very recently, almost entirely absent from the global conversation about justice, refugees, and the Middle East. Consider the asymmetry. When the world discusses refugees from the 1948 conflict, it discusses one group almost exclusively. There are international organizations, dedicated UN agencies, annual commemorations, university departments, and diplomatic frameworks built around one refugee population. The other, numerically comparable, historically older, and arguably subjected to more systematic legal persecution, remains functionally invisible. This is not a competition of suffering. No one's pain is diminished by acknowledging another's. But the historical record demands accuracy. And the historical record shows that between 1948 and the early 1970s, the Arab world carried out one of the most comprehensive ethnic displacements of the 20th century, erasing Jewish communities that had existed since the Babylonian exile, the Roman destruction of the temple, and the medieval golden ages of Islamic civilization. More than 850,000 people. More than 2,500 years of continuous presence, reduced to fewer than 8,600. In 1948, there were 850,000 Jews living across the Arab world. They built schools and hospitals. They spoke languages no one else will ever speak again. They buried their dead in cemeteries that are now parking lots or rubble. They signed declarations donating everything they had to governments that had taken everything from them. They boarded planes with one suitcase, or walked hundreds of kilometers through deserts, carrying nothing but Torah scrolls and their children. And for decades, almost nobody talked about it. Now you know. The question is whether knowing changes anything, or whether 8,600 is just a number the world has decided is close enough to zero.